Well, here we are again. We're talking about the powers of Congress, and specifically, our next two videos are going to be on the implied and non-legislative powers. Let's get started because it just seems like the right thing to do. Here we go. The powers of Congress. We're going to talk about the implied non-legislative powers with these objectives. This particular one in particular, which I said twice, sorry. By the time we're done, we're going to discuss the necessary and proper clause, or in other words, the elastic clause, and contrast what a strict and liberal constructionist is, or who a liberal or strict constructionist is. Let's begin with this. What does the Constitution have to say about education? Nothing. Not a word. Still, Congress provides tens of billions of dollars every year for the United States Department of Education to spend in a variety of ways throughout the country. Look around you. What indications of these federal dollars can you find in your local school? If you attend a public school anywhere in the United States, that evidence should not be hard to spot. If you're doing virtual school, maybe you have your own computer, maybe you've been provided with a Chromebook. And if you've been provided with a Chromebook, that was bought by federal dollars, right? $5 for each Chromebook. At least that's what it feels like they're worth sometimes. But they actually cost more, even though they operate basically on a $5 budget. They do cost more. If you're in a room and there's a whiteboard, or there's dry erase markers, or there are desks, or there are pictures on the wall and such, all of those things are federal dollars. Books, software, the Google Suite platform, the very learning management system that you are using right now. Every bit of this is federal dollars, at least most of it, that have come in to be used for education. So the necessary and proper clause is what makes this possible. The necessary and proper clause basically is this: these unspecified but undoubted congressional powers and many others emerge from a clause at the end of Article 1, Section H, which gives Congress to, quote, the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for the carrying into execution, or in other words, the other federal powers granted by the Constitution. The residual clause, called at various times the elastic clause or the sweeping clause, and from the 20th century onward, the necessary and proper clause, is the constitutional source of the vast majority of all federal laws. Virtually all the laws establishing the machinery of government, as well as the substantive laws ranging from anti-discrimination laws to labor laws, are enacted under the authority of the necessary and proper clause. This clause just might be the single most important clause in the Constitution. It basically means that anything that the government determines is necessary and proper for it to carry out its constitutional responsibilities is its power. So this video here is called The Elastic Clause. It's from Hip Hughes. It's a great YouTube video because he explains it so very well. I'm going to attach it in the link to this video so you've got it. I would definitely watch this because, again, this is a great video that is going to break down this elastic clause far better than I can. But I'm going to give it a shot anyways. So the expressed power and implied power, here's what it basically looks like. An expressed power set in Congress to lay and collect taxes. An implied power, in order for Congress to be able to make sure it does that, is to punish tax evaders, to regulate commodities and outlaw the use of others, to set conditions to qualify for federal funding. So these three things that I just mentioned are not in the Constitution. But the thing on the left, collecting taxes, is. In order for the government to be able to do the collecting of the taxes, it must be able to do the things on the right side. The things on the right side are necessary and proper for the Congress to be able to achieve its expressed power. To borrow money, therefore, to establish Federal Reserve system of banks. There's nothing in the Constitution that says there should be a Federal Reserve, but in order for Congress to be able to borrow money, it needs to necessarily and properly have a Federal Reserve System or something like that, to create naturalization laws, to bring in new citizens. But in order for it to do that, it needs to pass laws or have the power to regulate and limit immigration, to raise armies and a navy. In order for it to do that, it may need to draft Americans in the military, to regulate commerce. That is in the Constitution. What's not in the Constitution is establishing a minimum wage, banning discrimination in workplaces, passing laws protecting the disabled, regulating banking. But if the government is going to be able to regulate commerce, it necessarily and properly needs to be able to do those four things. To establish post offices. That's in the Constitution. What isn't necessarily in the Constitution? Prohibiting mail fraud and obstruction of the mail, barring the shipping of certain items through the mail. There's nothing in the Constitution that says government needs to do this or has to do this, but in order for the government to be able to establish the post office and make sure it runs as well as possible, it needs to be able to, it's necessary for it to be able to do these things. Hopefully you see how those two relate. We're going to conclude with another relating topic, which is strict and liberal constructionists. Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton were an example of either. Jefferson favored a very limited role for the new government. Majority of power would remain with the Senate, with the states, based on a strict reading of the necessary and proper clause in the Constitution to prevent the government from gaining too much power. So according to Jefferson, they all knew that the government would have a little bit of wiggle room by which to assert itself. But Thomas Jefferson was one that was a strict constructionalist, or in other words, he had a very narrow reading of the necessary and proper clause. Necessary and proper, yes, but not too necessary and not too proper. Let's not get too wild with this. Yes, you need these powers to do your job, but you don't need all of these powers. Meanwhile, Alexander Hamilton was a different kind of fella. He was a liberal constructionalist. He favored powerful government that could exercise implied powers a little bit more freely. He favored a vigorous executive leadership based on a liberal interpretation of the Constitution because the Constitution did not specify or grant the government these powers. So which one do you think was the anti-federalist? Which one do you think is the federalist? If you said Jefferson was an anti-federalist, if you said Hamilton was a federalist, you would be right. And if you said Jefferson was an anti-federalist, you would be right. So which one do you think back in the day won the argument? Was it Jefferson? Was it Hamilton? Who won? Yeah, it was Hamilton. And Jefferson, yeah. Now, it's not that the Anti-Federalists completely lost the argument. After all, we do have the Bill of Rights, and we do have checks and balances, but the Federalist argument kind of won the day, which is why we have a little bit more of a liberal reading of the necessary and proper clause, and that is why most of the powers afforded to Congress generally tend to be expressed because of it. The takeaway, the ways in which the necessary and proper clause has been construed, interpreted, and applied over the last 200 years has enabled the national government to meet the changing needs of the times. As a result, it has virtually eliminated the need for frequent amendments to the Constitution. We only have 27 amendments, and since the Bill of Rights was established and the Constitution with it was established, there have only ever been 17 amendments to the Constitution. We only have changed the Constitution or amended it 17 times since its instantiation with the Bill of Rights way back in the late 1700s. 17 times over 200 years is not a lot. Why? Necessary and proper clause. Because necessary and proper clause allows the government to flex, to bend without breaking. All right. Hopefully you understand that. When we come back, we're going to conclude this particular section of our discussion with other congressional powers and limitations. I will see you at that time.